So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're still on the West Coast joining us today. Grateful to have the opportunity to share with you on the 2025 National Church Virtual Seminar sponsored by CapinCrouse and Carr, and Ingram. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ted Batson. I'm a tax partner and the practice leader for the tax practice at CapinCrouse, and looking forward to the hour we have in front of us as we get on today. There is a couple of housekeeping matters we need to get out of the way quickly at the beginning. So first, if you're here and you're wanting to get CPE for today's presentation, this slide we'll leave up here for a couple of moments, but it has some key information. Number one is a reminder that an hour of CPE is 50 minutes. We'll be on for the full 60 minutes of this session in order to make sure that you have an opportunity to get that 50-minute credit. There is some partial credit if you're only able to be here for a part of it. And then the big thing is there will be polling questions. There'll be 4 polling questions that will pop up throughout this hour. You will need to answer at least 3 of those polling questions in order to get CPE credit for this session. So I'll be running those polling questions by you, or calling out for those polling questions as we go. And then, as you can see here, your attendance certificates and stuff will be mailed out after a few days from now, after the session. So today's session, we have a program description. This you should have seen a version of this before, but we're going to be talking about retirement planning for ministers in this context. I'll introduce my co-panelists here in a minute, 2 gentlemen who are really well-versed in this particular arena. And we have some learning objectives to share with you here. We're going to be looking a brief look at current economics. We'll talk about financial literacy and how we can offer planning resources to staff and pastors. We'll talk about church 403B plans and what are the advantages of having that. And we'll do some comparing and contrasting of church and non-church 403B plans. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to break it into these 4 parts, as you saw there. That kind of maps to the learning objectives. For our speakers today, I'm joined by 2 gentlemen with a lot of credentials here. Nabil Safi is a Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Servant Solutions in Indianapolis. And I've had an opportunity to work with folks at Servant Solutions for several years, and they are really skilled at this whole area of pastors and helping have retirement planning solutions for ministries. He's also has some service as an executive pastor. So he's not only been on the current side, but he's also been on the receiving side of this kind of advice in the past. Also joined today by Art Tennille. Art is the Director of Retirement Solutions at Guidestone Financial and makes his home in Nashville. But today he is helping ministries across the country, as is Nabil, in designing retirement planning solutions for their pastors and staff. So I'm glad to welcome both of these gentlemen as we get started today.
Thank you, Ted. Glad to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So as we said at the outset, we wanted to kind of start with a brief look at what kinds of economic factors, demographic trends, and things like that might be driving any interest or needs in the retirement planning sector. And I know in my own situation, I'm bringing up I'm in the tail end of the baby boomer generation with my birthday in 1964. So guys, what are we seeing in our church populations around either economic factors or demographic factors that are driving the retirement planning conversation? And Nabil, I'll start with you since you're on the top of my screen.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be with you guys. Well, as we know, the church most of the time experiences a lagging factor of the economic factors that happens in the marketplace. And whether it is in this quarter or the previous quarter or this year or the previous year, we learned that during COVID, we experienced a lagging factor of all the economical impact as well. So specifically right now, we are experiencing some what we call like moderate growth in the U.S. economy as a GDP, like between 2 and 3% compared to 3.8% last quarter, and how would that impact the church? So our important topic here is like, how would that impact the church? The church will have people who would come uncertain about their giving and future giving. And executive pastors like me in the past and current pastors right now start looking like, what would our budget be and what would our revenue sources be for the next coming season? So these would be like some indicators to look at in this season as well.
Yeah,
Art,
good.
what would you add to that?
Yeah, and I'm sure glad to be able to walk this journey with you guys today and ladies out there. So thank you for having us here, Ted. You know, I think one good call out for all of us to keep in the back of our minds, especially as it relates to retirement and preparing for that, is inflation that we've seen in recent years and how that has eroded the buying power for pastors and other staff, and maybe they have felt on track, and maybe that's gotten them to look at their budgets as they create a budget and think about their retirement budget and realize that it's going to take a little bit more income to cover those expenses now in retirement. And so what we could see from that is a trend of pastors ending up, or staff ending up, deciding to work longer, which could be a great thing, could be a great blessing to the church, but flip that and it might not be the best thing for the church. But one way or the other, I think it has put some stress on some folks as they look toward the future, knowing that they're going to have more expenses to cover, which just means as we walk the path today, we've got to be super intentional as individuals. And so for us who have people like that under our care, you as the employers and us as ministry partners that walk alongside you, that we do a great job of nudging them forward to take steps to be ready for that moment as it comes later, even with the added stress of higher inflation.
Yeah, so I've been noticing an uptick in conversations I have with clients who have pastors who have maybe had long-term roles. Maybe they've been in their senior leadership role for 30 or more years, and now retirement has become a real sharp focus. Are you guys seeing more churches having to think creatively about how to deal, even if they've had a retirement plan in place for a while? Are they having to be even more creative as they think about a pastor who's had a long-term service, but maybe nonetheless still has inadequate retirement savings?
I'll hop in just for a minute. I was actually at a church last week, and this very issue came up with the executive staff of that church. They were thinking about a long-term minister on staff, and he had been so faithful, and yet they felt like he perhaps wasn't quite prepared for retirement. So they were trying to look at options to try to give him a boost right there at the finish line so that he could finish well. And I admire the church for doing that. And so we ended up kind of having an impromptu consultation on, well, how could we do that? And they were probably thinking about paying that pastor a bonus, a cash bonus. And we all know what comes with cash bonuses, and that's a big tax bill typically, or withholding bill at least. And so we talked about the fact that, they're in the church retirement plan, which we'll get into specifics of that later, and the flexibility that offers for discretionary contributions up to those limits. And perhaps because of housing allowance in retirement, if they chose to make a contribution into his retirement account, a pretty sizable one, it could, go into his account without taxes today, and then potentially a year or two now down the road, as he's withdrawing it as housing, he doesn't pay taxes either. So that is a real thing. So you're right, Ted.
Yeah, I just recently was speaking with a gentleman who had exited a senior pastor role after 25 or so years. He was in a new chapter of his life, but his church had done exactly that. And I'm like, I really wish you guys had talked to somebody before they wrote you that big check, because they could have fashioned something that would have been so much more tax efficient. Now, tax efficiency is a laudable objective, but it's not the only objective in the world. But we don't want the tax tail to wag the dog, is something that people around here know I say. But nonetheless, tax efficiency can be a powerful tool. Nabil, are you seeing some of that same kind of demographic thing with older pastors?
Yes, and unfortunately, I'm glad that Art experienced this week a positive story. The last couple of weeks, we've been experiencing some stories of several pastors that they are not able to pass the baton to the next generation, and it's impacting the younger folks on staff. And that's why we saw a couple of staff members kind of transition from one church to another because they felt that there was a lid. And there's a sentiment, and I understand pastors who are not ready for retirement, and I want to be a little very compassionate in this conversation, because if they're not prepared well, they don't know where their next check is coming from. And this is where we want to make sure that we start early, start now, and make sure that they are ready for that. And this is a, I would say, like, it's a church-wide crisis across the nation. It's not just like in a certain denomination or certain church groups, but like it's across, and we're seeing it like on and on.
Let's do our first polling question now. And so let me call that up. Get that launched. So remember, for those of you who are attending, that first poll question should be showing up on your screen. And we want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to answer this one. One of the other things, while people are doing that, guys, Social Security is another aspect of the retirement puzzle. And I'm wondering what you guys are seeing in terms of pastors who are successfully integrating Social Security in with whatever retirement. And how are you dealing with, and are you encountering folks who opted out and are now finding that they didn't really understand what they did when they opted out?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. We see that relatively often, and there seems to have been a season in the past where a lot of pastors did that, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And many of those are aging today and realizing the impact of their decision. Social Security, as we all know, it's a big leg of the stool in retirement. And if we've opted out of that as a pastor, we're going to find ourselves really having to take on a lot more responsibility in preparing to have the resources to live life in the future, not to mention the potential disability benefits and the Medicare and all that. Of course, there's spousal Social Security available to many of them, but saving in advance additional is difficult to do, as we all know. And so they do face that. But there is good news on the horizon. I don't know if many of you listening have been following it, but there is something called the Clergy Act that is working its way through Congress right now. It is still very much active legislation. We are following it. I'm sure, Nabil, you at Servant Solutions are following it closely too. At Guidestone, we're following it very closely, have tried to advocate on its behalf. And there is a decent chance it could pass. And if it does pass in 2026 and 27, there may be a window for those who opted out to opt back in. Of course, that comes with having to take on that 15.3% right away. And so I would encourage anyone on your team who's following it and maybe thinking of doing that, start living on 15.3% less today. Put that aside, start practicing, because that's what you're going to have to do to get back in. But it could be a great benefit, and we hope that it passes.
Yes.
I had a recent conversation with somebody who had been tracking, they had opted out, but they had some quarters of coverage that were related to some work before they became a minister. Now, you can also have bivocational people who are generating quarters of coverage while they're in ministry. But he was a few quarters short. And for him, the bigger issue was less. He was going to be not receiving a Social Security benefit on his own, but also Medicare and getting free access to Medicare was going to be an issue for him. And so, but he had a few quarters of coverage, so he only needed about 5 more. And so then we were talking about some strategies for this. And my off the cuff, somewhat humorous response to him was, I think you just need to become a Walmart greeter in your second act, because that's going to get you quarters of coverage. It's a low impact job, and it allows you to interact with people. But Nabil, you want to add anything before I move on to the next topic?
Well, yeah, we encourage everybody to finish their quarters, at least if they cannot do that, if they have them from previous employment. But originally, Social Security is designed to cover like 40% of our revenue in retirement. So a retirement plan is in place. That would be an ideal thing. But usually, also we're living longer, and as we know that Social Security started early on with 65 years at the age of retirement, but people's longevity, life expectation was at 64. Now, depends whether you're a woman or a man, it's around 78. And so requirements are different, and life needs are different, and costs are different. So that's why we have to make sure that all these are taken into place. And a lot of people opt out of Social Security still till today. Unfortunately, some people get bad advice, and I would recommend that we recommend against that, honestly, and we want to make sure that people stay in that as much as possible, because very few people are able to develop the behavior and the discipline of taking this 15.3%, like Art was saying, and live either less or just invest the difference in and whether it is life and disability and other things that to complete that. So it's important to look into that. And yes, hopefully in 26, 27, we can get another window of opportunity like during President Reagan, then when some people came back in, and so we can bring people back in as well.
We've had a couple questions real quick in the Q&A start. I'm going to answer those real quick and then we'll move on. So the first one, Christine asked, what does opting out of Social Security mean? There is a very narrow window at the beginning of a minister's ministry, and within the first 2 years of earning ministerial compensation, that if they are conscientiously opposed, they have to sign a formal statement stating that they are conscientiously and for religious reasons opposed to participating in a government-sponsored insurance or retirement or disability arrangement, which is essentially Social Security and Medicare. They file a Form 4361. But when you do that, now you don't have the safety net of Medicare or Social Security when you retire. And Nabil mentioned bad advice. There have been advisors out there who have been counseling people that, hey, just go ahead and sign this. Maybe don't read that statement too closely, and you'll be better off if you save for retirement yourself rather than relying on a Social Security system that may or may not be there when you reach retirement age. Well, now we have people who are reaping what they sowed when they made those decisions, and that's kind of what we've been talking about in this last couple of minutes. And then Michelle asked, how many quarters are necessary for benefits? How long ago can those quarters be obtained? Well, first off, there's no expiration date on obtaining the quarters. So a person who's 60 years old, as I am, they could have obtained quarters of coverage when they were 21 or 22 or 23, and those quarters would still count to their benefit. And you're required to have at least 40 quarters of coverage, which equates to 10 years in order to be able to receive free Medicare. If you have 40 quarters of coverage for Social Security, you'll get a benefit. It just won't be a full benefit because you'll have a lot of 0 years of earnings in your earnings history there. So it'll be a much diminished benefit over what someone who had always been part of Social Security. And it was mentioned about, I think, Art, you mentioned spousal benefits. Those are an important part of the puzzle for Social Security planning. So let's switch topics. So let's talk about financial literacy. I'm sure you guys, as you are interacting with church leaders, we often hear pastors from the pulpit talking about tithing or other things to their congregation. But in reality, within the church office itself, between the pastoral team and the staff, they often have a deficit in their understanding of how to think about financial matters. What are you guys seeing either in your organizations or what others are doing in terms of trying to bring some financial education and retirement education to the church office? And Nabil, why don't we start with you?
Who?
Nabil, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. Yeah, well, that's an interesting topic. Obviously, we all know that money is a hard issue before it is just numbers. And when it comes to retirement, because it's something in the future, human behavior kind of tend to push this to the back of our mind. So we don't want to look at it. We want to talk about it right now. And especially if we don't understand it, and most ministers, especially in leadership positions, do not fully comprehend the implications and the dynamics of all of that. So what we try to do is we try to speak the church language, and we try to say, like, we want to lock arms with you, and like organizations like Guidestone and Servant Solutions so that you can continue to propel the mission of Jesus Christ. And what does that look like? That looks like we are empowering leaders so that they can pass the baton as they experience financial freedom, so they can feel like, okay, I am financially free and I'm financially independent. So I can pass the baton and I become like a mentor, and I can step aside so that the next generation and the pipeline could keep moving forward. When we start talking this language, then we have an audience, and then we can start going into the details of the mission and how we can do this in details.
So Art, what are you
Yeah.
guys seeing at Guidestone?
Yeah, very similar. I would say that as we interact with church teams, regardless of where we are in the country, we find a great hunger for just the basics of finance and family planning. And so we have started to integrate into a session on getting started or planning for retirement. We'll have a session that starts with the basics of, creating a budget, paying off debt, and spending less than you earn, kind of bringing those principles to life, and just weighing in on that for a minute, talking through that with the team, because it's so difficult to make any headway on planning and preparing for the future if we haven't gotten those things taken care of. They're like weights that pull us down. And so we'll spend some time educating on that, thinking about, creating an emergency fund and the value of that, and saving for that next major purchase rather than buying it on credit and paying it off after the fact and paying interest. All those things that probably most everybody listening knows pretty well. But I find that it's very important to share that, especially with so many young people coming on church staff today. We see lots and lots of young people, especially at growing churches, which is great to see, and they need those basics to carry them through life, because really financial wellness, it's sort of the interconnected sum of all of our actions and our disciplines in this area. And so it really does all fit together, which means we probably need an intentional education plan, of which, your partner can help you with that, even though what we major on is retirement, Nabil, right? That's what we major on, but we try to talk about these other foundational principles along the way.
Yeah, because we want to help them create margin, and without margin, they cannot plan for retirement.
That's well said.
Yeah. Well, when we think about different tools and techniques that can be used to help deliver that message to people on staff at churches, I'm sure that both of your organizations have financial literacy workshops or things like that. I don't know to what extent you offer one-on-one counseling. Art, you mentioned that meeting the other day sort of turned into that. And there are all kinds of web-based tools. I don't know to what extent Guidestone and Servant Solutions make available any kind of tools, whether they're budgeting apps or other kind of retirement calculators, whatnot. What are you guys seeing being effective in helping move the needle? And I'm guessing maybe it's not a one size fits all or an either or, but maybe a both and answer. But Nabil, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I mean, we do webinars, we do workshops, we visit churches, we do like staff luncheons, lunch and learns, and those are we think those are like what put ourselves in front of this church staff so that we can get to a place where we have one-on-one conversations. In our case, we are blessed to be able to offer like financial planning at no cost to the members, and we want to make sure that we extend that, because we believe once people open up about their whole picture, then we include their spouse, we include their family, so that we make sure that we could, I like to call it like a roadmap. We look at life expectancy, we look at lifestyle, and we look at legacy. And those are the top three things that we want them, whether they are younger or they are older, to make sure that they look at those three lenses and whatever their income and expenses they have into it. And of course, there are some online calculators and other things designed like apps to do those as well. Yeah.
So Art, what's your experience been with trying to educate church staff and pastors in this arena of financial and retirement planning?
Yep. pretty similar to what he said. I would say that these lunch and learns and group meetings that we'll have, and if you're listening out there thinking about your provider, having that moment with your team every so often, and it might not need to be every year even, but potentially every other year or so, having that moment of a lunch and learn really engages people. There's some cross learning that can take place from Q&A. But what I like the most about that moment is it typically nudges them to take a good next step, like have one of those one-on-one consultations. So the morning might start out with a group meeting, and then the rest of my day or my team's day will fill with individual appointments where we can sit one-on-one with Susie and Sam and Sally and look at their individual situation. I see Nabil saying the same thing there. And so that's when the real aha moments happen, is when we sit down, we pull up their account, and we just give some good coaching in the moment based on their situation. And so that's why I really like the combination of those two. Also, we found that, and we learned this during COVID, as I'm sure everybody else did, virtual is a really great thing for these one-on-ones. So even if you have it on site, offer a virtual option, which we do at Guidestone as well. In fact, we have a team that helps support that, because often then they can do it on a convenient day. And oftentimes the spouse will join them, which is super helpful in family planning so that everybody's on the same page. So I really like that. And then I'll be quick here, but you mentioned digital tools. I think those types of things are important. You might not think that for everybody, some maybe less than others, but they allow people to do things at their own pace. They allow people who have short learning spans to use little video snippets and little tools online that help with key elements of the planning journey. And it allows them to personalize their results and projections. And I would say, if nothing else, if they're a good tool, they illuminate reality. And that's often what we all need, right? We need to see reality. Oh my goodness, look at this projection. Look at this score in our retirement readiness. My score is a 47. That really wakes me up, and hopefully in time to pivot and be more intentional about my retirement savings.
I have found it very interesting. You know, ministers are in ministry because of their giftedness, which doesn't always extend to numbers and finances. And I have had more than one occasion where that spouse gets on the phone, and this is a little bit stereotypically in the sense that it's the guy who's the minister, and it's his wife who comes on that call with me, and she asks super perceptive questions. And clearly, in their relationship, she's the one who's got the financial. She's wearing the financial hat as a matter of giftedness, and that is a powerful thing when you can have them both in the conversation, and she gets the opportunity to ask those questions directly. So a minute ago, Nabil said something interesting in my mind, and that was this notion that whenever we're talking about financial literacy and retirement planning, that there's a sense in which it has an element of serving the mission of a church. And I wanted to kind of unpack that a little more. So when we think about a couple of things, and Nabil, you may have actually said this one, and I'm just not remembering it, but the notion that, for one thing, if they have stress lifted off them, they can be more effective. If they have guidance of where they're going to go, or to your point about that readiness score, then that can be a load lifted. And but what are some other things we can think about in this literacy part, before we move on to some other things about making sure that's aligned with the mission of a particular ministry or church?
I would add that this is directly connected to church health. Over a decade ago, the Eli Lilly Foundation did an interesting research and found out that on pastors and churches, and found out that a lot of pastors kind of suffer under the burden of lack of retirement planning and student debt. And these were the two main stressors that are impacting their ministry. As a result, a lot of them are because, a normal or like a typical pastor goes to school, and sometimes they accumulate debt, and then they go to an assignment, and, everybody goes to ministry. They're not there for the money. So sometimes those numbers do not match with life. and life happens and ministry happens, and they start eliminating things. And some of that, like paying for student debt and also for retirement, they don't participate in the retirement plan for their employer. And as a result, they become stressed out, and eventually turnover becomes higher. And this is what they found. And also the church suffers because if a pastor's house is not in order financially, then they are suffering when they come to the pulpit to teach about money. And then the giving suffers and the mission of the church suffers. So we try to talk about how can we reverse that by helping them through financial stewardship, like Art was talking about in the one-on-one conversations and all that. We'd like to transform those stories into from horror stories to hallelujah stories. So that's how I look at it.
There you go. So we've had a couple people kind of chime in on the Q&A, and then we'll do a polling question. So Jill asked, wouldn't regular compensation reviews for fair and adequate pay for all staff members be an integral part of proper preparation? And certainly that's an aspirational goal for a lot of congregations. There are a lot of congregations that are maybe smaller congregations, or maybe just haven't are still living in a mindset of the definition of fair and adequate not being necessarily what others who are participating in today's webinar might think of as fair and adequate. But certainly that is an interesting component part. I don't know if either of you guys want to chime in on that before I move on to the next question.
Yeah, I'll take. I'd like to make one comment about it. At least, you think about in the past, many churches have set salaries based on what the last person made or what the budget is, there's got to be that context. But what we have found in having consultations with churches is that many have not considered the environment that's around the church, so the market that the church sits in and the cost of living that's there. And so the missing element has been this market-based compensation, setting of compensation, and at least doing some kind of survey on that, like churchsalary.com or other surveys that are out there that do a great job of helping to compare the pastor to another local professional, like a school principal or a teacher, depending on the role on the church staff, but try to compare it to someone in the community of commensurate level of experience and responsibility. And when we do that, then we see salaries set at a little bit better level. And not to mention that, but also building in space for increases as the years go by, and not just setting it and forgetting it, because that's often done in some churches as well, as you know.
So Caleb asked if the pastor is opted out and his spouse, so this is now opted out, back to opting out of Social Security, and his spouse has accumulated quarters of coverage, would they not get a spousal benefit? And that was mentioned earlier. Yes, there is a spousal benefit. It's not enough at the end of the day. So that's to be aware of. It's better than nothing, as my dad would say. It's better than a stick in the eye, but it's not necessarily going to be a panacea, and it's not going to necessarily be a replacement. So there's still retirement planning that needs to take place. All right, let me move on to the next polling question. All right, what types of financial literacy and planning resources do you feel would be the most effective for your church staff? Those of you who are on today's call, if you want to take a crack at this question. So guys, we're going to shift gears to talking about 403B plans for the remaining time that we have today. And I think an interesting place to start would be to talk about the 403B plan as a church plan versus a non-church 403B plan. And Art, if you don't mind starting us with kind of what the differences are between a 403B plan that's a church plan and a non-church 403B plan.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first word that comes to mind is the flexibility that it allows. There's just so much flexibility in a church 403B plan. Obviously, there are the plans benefits for ministers and so forth, but the flexibility that it allows the church, because they are a church, to provide a benefit that is custom tailored to that moment in time for that church family and what they need to do, meaning they can do things like discriminate among staff members. They can provide different benefits for different segments of the staff, or they could provide a seniority-based benefit. And that can help a church at times who are trying to make decisions about limited resources. They can provide the rewards where they feel like they're most needed at the time. So there's that whole element. And the bill, you might want to comment a little bit more on that, but there's also the administrative burden of a church retirement plan is so much less significant than an ERISA-based plan. All those filings that you don't have to do. And so there's just a lot of advantages to being in a church plan.
Yeah, and Bill, would you add anything to Art's comments there?
No, I think he said it well. The burden of, I want to emphasize the burden of being compliant to IRS if you're not in a church plan, because you have to file the Form 5500 and you get into audits and make sure that you have a compliance officer to make, and this could be costly, and it would end up costing the church more than if you are in a church plan. And those dollars, instead of being in ministry dollars or compensation benefit dollars for the staff, it's going away to be compliant with a non-church plan.
Yeah, I know at CapinCrouse, we have a lot of clients who are not churches, that are ministries who are not churches and are not eligible to have a church plan. And they do have that 5,500 filing requirement. And they do have, once they cross the 100 participant threshold, they have an annual audit requirement. And that just adds, as you indicated, both of you, it just adds cost to the structure. Now, 403B plans, whether they're church plans or non-church plans, can have some other features. And what are you guys seeing as having the or having retention and other compensation element benefits to help retain staff in the 403B plans that you guys talk about? And I'm thinking about things like how you get in, matching, Roth versus non-Roth, some of those kinds of things. Art, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of those things you mentioned are so important. I mean, so the flexibility to have no waiting period, which we would highly recommend that a member be able to start immediately upon employment is a great benefit there. The Roth versus tax sheltered question. A lot of people think Roth is only available in a Roth IRA, but that Roth bucket, so to speak, is available now in 403B plans and has been for a number of years. And so for, particularly for a younger person who's not a minister, it's even, it could be very advantageous for that person to take advantage of Roth. And so making sure that the plan allows for Roth contributions can be a significant benefit for folks as they think about getting into retirement and having that mixture of taxable and non-taxable income to have an appropriate withdrawal strategy, in the years ahead. And of course, now coming on the scene is employer Roth as an option, and that's now available in 403B plans. Many plans are taking a look at that today as we've been consulting this year, and they can be amended to include an employer Roth, which means the employee basically asks the employer to make the employer contribution into their account be Roth. And so that's brand new. It came about from Secure Act. And so we've been consulting this year with a lot of churches who are considering that. It may or may not be necessary because an in-plan Roth conversion could accomplish the same goal. So some churches may choose to take the little bit less burdensome route and do that. But those are very important. And I know I'm going quickly here, but I'll hit on the matching contributions. So the beauty in the church retirement plans, to having a non-match or a match or a blend is so important when we think about the fact that we all probably, based on most financial advisors, need to be saving 15% all the way through life in order to have enough saved up when we get to retirement to maintain that standard of living that we've been used to. That 15%, that's intimidating number, right? And most of us as individuals would say, my goodness, I'm not sure I can do that, especially when I'm starting my career. And most churches would say, my goodness, I can't do that for the team either. And so it typically is going to take both the employer and the employee coming together to bring to bear that 15% savings rate. So I would encourage churches, many churches for many years provided only a non-match, and perhaps that's a nod back to the old days of defined benefit plans when the church took care of all of it. But in today's world, I encourage churches to look at the opportunity of bringing a match to the table, because that is probably the biggest motivator to get the members, the employees, to also come to the table with their own savings. I'll stop there, Nabil.
Yeah, Nabil, what would you add to that?
Yeah, and just to continue this point, because yes, it is a burden. I 100% agree, and we encourage churches and staff to start small or start like incremental increase, and there are capacities to do like auto enroll and auto increase as well. Every year, you just add 1% so you can get to that place of health, because 1% at a time usually doesn't impact the budget, whether it's a church budget or it is a family budget. So it becomes like an incremental growth. And going back to the Roth as well, I think there's beauty in the Roth, especially for those who are starting younger and they are not licensed or ordained. Because if they think that they are now like in a lower tax bracket, they can benefit from that. They can pay the taxes now, and they can invest their money in a Roth, a 403b. It can grow tax deferred, and in retirement they can take it out tax free. So hoping that over time their income will grow, and then they will be in a higher tax bracket, and they would save that, because everything tells us that usually in the future taxes are going to be more than less than now. But if they are ordained, then that's a different conversation because of the housing allowance, and that's a benefit that both our plans kind of offer in retirement as well. If you want to talk about that now or later.
Yeah, let's go ahead and pivot to the minister's housing allowance. So we know that ministers during their period of employment can receive a housing allowance designation. The mechanics of how the housing allowance actually works is beyond the scope of our conversation for today, but suffice it to say it's a powerful income tax planning event during employment. But in retirement, it has even perhaps additional power, I think, because of the fact that you don't have an income tax, you don't have the SECA tax burden anymore on the housing allowance dollar. So Nabil, in the typical 403b9 church plan, we would generally anticipate a housing allowance could be designated, right? And if so, what are some of the mechanics of that?
So as ministers accumulate their accounts and they fund them over time, there comes a time when they are eligible to start taking contributions. According to IRS, it's 59 and a half, or some other plans, they have different age limits for that. So once they start doing that, they are still ordained, but they are no longer in employment. In the past, when they were employed, the church had the housing allowance authority to give that for them, and they did it through their minutes, through their board. Now an organization like Guidestone or Servant Solutions becomes technically their employer if we're holding their account. So every year Guidestone and Servant Solutions would designate a housing allowance, like a blanket authorization, so that they can claim that. So when distribution comes every year, and at the end of the year when they are issued their 1099-R, then they can choose that this amount we want it to be under housing allowance, making sure that they maintain their receipts and they talk to their accountant as well.
So it's a very powerful thing because you're getting the benefit. Art, you mentioned earlier that person who's made their contributions while they're employed, and then they come out, and you could conceivably, rather than having that bonus approach, let's make that as a 403b plan contribution, that extra amount for a retiring pastor, let's make that as a 403b plan contribution. So it goes in tax-free, and then with the housing allowance, they have the opportunity to potentially receive it tax-free on the other side. And that's pretty powerful tax planning.
Yeah, it really is. You know, one more thing to add to that too. You think about the higher limits that we have in the 403b plans than are in, say, an IRA. And so when someone gets into their high earnings years and maybe the kids are off the payroll finally, right, and they're at a spot where there's a little more room in the budget, they can make significant contributions, you know, in the range of $30,000 at the limits today into their 403b if the budget allows at home from their paycheck at the church. So they significantly lower their taxable income in these last few years and put it away for potential use as housing in the future. So you're right. It's a very powerful tool, and it stays, you know, as he said, we sort of take the baton from the church in retirement, and then that stays with that minister all the way until his death. It doesn't continue for the spouse, but it does continue for the minister for the rest of his life.
Yeah. So two technical points. One you just said, Art, and that is that the spouse can continue to receive a spousal benefit from the 403b plan because it's the family's money in essence, just in a tax deferred account. But she cannot receive, or he, if the wife was the minister, the non-minister spouse cannot receive housing allowance once the minister spouse has passed away. That's one technical point to make sure everybody walks away with. And a second one is that when you retire, if you want the housing allowance benefit to stay in place, you have to leave it in the 403b plan. If you roll to an IRA or you roll to another employer's 403b or 401k plan that's not a church plan, then you will mess up your access to the minister's housing allowance. So this is a key thing to remember in retirement is you need to stay within the context. So guys, Nicole has asked us, how do we know if our 403b plan is a church plan? So, you know, we're talking about church plan like it's a topic, a term everybody should be familiar with. How could they open up their plan document, for example, and figure out if it's a church plan?
I think they're looking for that number 9 when they open up that plan document. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah. So somewhere in that plan document, we should see 403 in parentheses, the small letter B, and then in parentheses, the number 9, right? Somewhere in there. And maybe the word church plan might even be called out as a term as well. And your provider, if you have an administrator, that administrator ought to be able to affirm it's a church plan. And if you have a competent administrator and they're not having you file a 5500 and or obtain an audit if you have over the 100, that means they've probably self-assessed that you're a church plan. Otherwise, you would have these compliance requirements.
Yeah, and usually they have like church, the church plans, they have like a church sponsor. And the church sponsor would be like the group or denomination as well that was birthed off. Like in our case, it's the Church of God out of Anderson, Indiana. In Guidestone's case, it's out of the Southern Baptist. So those are, and there are like 55 organizations across the US that were designated by the IRS with this kind of designation of 9. And you can do that, but you want to make sure that there's a church sponsor that is supporting that as well.
So question was asked just real quick, Rebecca, no, there are not slides for the session. We can certainly give you the slides that have our names on them, but that's pretty much it for today. Kind of looking back at our prepared notes, guys, when you think about a 403b plan, a 403b9 church plan, and you're wanting it to align with the mission and ministry of the church, is there anything that needs to be specifically thought about in terms of drafting the plan document, or is it pretty much by its very nature, the 403b9 plan is going to support the mission and ministry of the church?
I'll start. I mean, I think you're right that certainly by nature it is, but there are elements that, you know, that just by helping them to practice stewardship, helping to shape the conversation around what's the purpose of this. You know, we're not all about just creating wealth for the future. We're about stewarding now so that we can be prepared and resourced in the years ahead to say yes to whatever God's calling us to in that last semester. And I think that's the most exciting thing Bill and I get to go out and serve churches, that we try to help the church build that stewardship mentality into the minds of the team. So that's one thing. And the second thing I can think of, and I imagine Nabil will have others, is the whole idea of faith-based investing. That's important to align the church and the retirement plan with faith-based investing. You think about the employees of the church investing in mutual funds. So if you think about the Guidestone funds and others that are Christian screened funds, but not only that, the newest frontier in faith-based investing that actually excites me as much or more than the screening is this advocacy in the boardrooms now, and so shareholder advocacy. So the fact that we can go and vote the proxies for everyone who owns the shares to at a place like, we'll just say any company, Target came to mind. So we could vote against something or for something at a shareholder meeting that would be appropriate in alignment with our shared values as a church and as a team and as a group of evangelicals. And so to me, that is probably the more exciting part of faith-based investing today in today's world.
Guys, let's get another polling question. Slip another polling question in here real quick. So I'll get that started. So gang who are on participating today, here's poll question number 3. What do you feel is the biggest advantage of a church 403B plan over the traditional nonprofit plan? Guys, I don't know if this question that's kind of popped up a couple times in the Q&A is within the scope of your expertise or not, but let me, since it's shown up more than once, let's see if we can address it. The question is, variations of the question are, our church used to have a 403B plan, but now we have a 401k plan. Should we consider going back to a 403B 9 plan? Or alternatively, we have a 401k plan. Can we nonetheless have a minister's housing allowance be designated out of that 401k plan? And I know that 401k plans can be under ERISA or not under ERISA, but I'm not sure about the housing allowance part. So do you guys want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's going to be very hard for them to justify, and that the 401k plan can offer housing allowance. That's going to be stretching the code sometimes beyond its limits. So they want to be very careful, especially if they have ministers on their staff. I would recommend that, even if it's hard to switch from one plan to the other, but then they could include another 403B plan and then freeze the 401k plan, and then they can over time transition to a healthy place.
Yeah. Art, do you guys do any counseling on this kind of thing at Guidestone? Did this question come up?
It's very rare. I mean, because we deal primarily with the 403B9s. But our compliance area would probably be the one to answer that question best. And so if someone does have a question and wants to reach out, I can get some help on that. There may be a case where there's a church 401k plan if structured appropriately, but I'm not certain, so I better not comment on it any further.
Sure. So when we talk about being retired and receiving a housing allowance for the plan, I think maybe there's a little bit of a misconception here, because really it's when you're eligible to start taking distributions from the plan. There's not an actual requirement that you separate from service before you can start receiving distributions from the plan, right? You just have to be over age 59 and a half to the standard age that you mentioned. So once you start receiving distributions, then you can work with your plan sponsor to talk about that designation. Now, it could be doubled up. And if you already are still employed and you're getting a minister's housing allowance through your compensation, getting one through you can't double up in terms of the benefit. There's still only one number you can exclude at the end of the day. Agreed. Oh, we kind of touched on this point earlier, but let's go back to it maybe a little harder, a little more head on, and that is 403B plans, 403B church plans specifically are exempt from ERISA's discrimination rules as on a broad-based sense. So to what extent can we leverage that from the flexibility, Art, that you've talked about a couple of times? Mm-hmm. We have all this flexibility. How does that flexibility play out when we talk about the non-application of the ERISA discrimination rules?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is some churches may decide they want to do something different. Let's say perhaps a mega church. They want to do something different for an executive team than they might do for other parts of the team, or for the ministerial team than for the rest of the team. And so they don't get caught up in testing issues if they choose to do that. So basically, the church can structure the plan in the way that makes the best sense for the church at that point in time. Or it may be that the church can only provide a benefit. There's just a certain season that they're walking through right now, and they can only provide a benefit for a certain segment of the staff. And so they want to do that. And so they could, for a season at least, choose just to do that for that part of the staff and then change it. And you heard me say start and stop. That's a great thing about a church plan too. It's very simple to change the plan. Nabil, you mentioned when you were talking about auto enrollment, which is a wonderful tool, and about 90% of the people don't opt out of that, by the way, once they start it, as long as it's not set too high. And so that's a great tool. But you're right, just like individuals have to sort of stair step up, a church can do the very same thing and kind of create a roadmap with budget planning with the finance team and say, well, we're going to start with a 1% this year and a 2% next year. And so you can constantly make tweaks to the plan. There's just all that flexibility built in.
Now, we kind of touched on this briefly earlier, but just to kind of seal the thought process here, the question was asked: does it make sense to make Roth contributions if you're ordained and you know you're going to get the housing allowance on the backside when you retire? And I think the standard planning answer to that, and you guys can confirm this for me, is that if you're ordained and you know you're going to get a housing allowance on the backside, then there's no need to put it in the Roth on the front side. That works more for your non-ordained, licensed or commissioned staff. Is that a fair kind of broad-based statement? Now, let me remind everyone, we're not giving tax advice here. Everybody needs to kind of sit down with their own tax advisor to work out the ifs, ands, and buts of everything that we're saying here. But I think that's the general sense of things, right?
Go ahead.
That's one way to look at it, and depends on the individual situation. And I believe that's a financial planning conversation too, because in certain instances, there are pastors who are really savvy when it comes to planning for retirement. And if they are young enough and they have accumulated enough in their retirement plan, and we know that usually we live probably 1/3 of our lives in retirement, probably 20 to 25 years, 30 years. And if we feel like as a minister, they had enough nest eggs so that they can claim it as housing allowance, and they're still young enough so that they can do Roth right now instead of pre-tax, then in some instances they can do that, so they can pay it now and forget about paying it later. So, but that's not the common practice.
Mm-hmm. I guess the other thing to remember is that when you're in retirement and you don't have a mortgage payment anymore and your housing costs are lower, your actual housing expenses might only be $10 or $15 or $20,000 a year, and if you're pulling out $60,000 in retirement plan distributions, you're still going to have a fair amount subject to tax. So this is why it gets down to that individual discussion and individualized planning consideration. Another thing that people have been asking is, all right, so ministers have retired, but they haven't been connected with our group for a long time. Maybe they had a period as a minister and they left ministry, left their money in the 403B plan. Now they're retiring and they want to get a housing allowance. Can they still do that even though they're either not currently on our particular organization's roles as a minister, although they were back in the time they were making contributions? And so what's the answer to that kind of question?
Yeah. As long as that income was earned in the course of ministry, so there's the first part of the answer. And as long as it's still in that church retirement plan where we can designate that housing allowance for them, then that's good. Even if they went in and did a secular career after the fact, that money is still available for housing. It sure is. Because once you're a minister, you are a minister.
Yeah, we have the last polling question coming up on, and I'm sorry that I stepped on top of you, Rachel. I think I did not have that on my screen. We're going to deal with one more question while this last poll is up. Well, I guess this isn't really a question so much as just a real quick comment. Somebody asked about rabbi trust and 409A plans for a senior pastor. So that's kind of outside the context of qualified plans which are what 403B plans are. Can you do a 409A non-qualified deferred compensation plan with an associated rabbi trust for a retiring senior pastor or a senior pastor who's still got a few years in front of them, but you're wanting to try and fund some additional retirement savings? The answer is yes. Yes, you can do that. You need to be mindful when you're starting to get into those. We talked earlier about are we paying pastors enough? But there's also the flip side of this is can we run into a situation where we're paying pastors too much? And the Internal Revenue Code would have an answer that would say it's possible to get to there under what's called the intermediate sanctions rules for excess benefit transactions, and excessive compensation is one of those ways you get there. We talk about compensation studies sometimes on that side of the equation, as well as on the lower end where we're trying to make sure we're actually getting up to what's a reasonable compensation. Then we also deal with it on the backside about what's unreasonable. So yes, it's possible to do that. So it's a lot more art to that than it is to the 403B plan arena. And so that's worthy of its own session at some point in time. So with that, we're at the top of the hour, or the bottom of the hour, I guess I should say, at the end of our 60 minutes. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're grateful for your participation. Thank you to Nabil and Art for joining me today on the CapinCrouse webinar. We're wonderfully blessed to have friends like them. So thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.